So, depending on who you are and where you get your news from, you may be seeing a completely separate version of the news from your neighbor down the street, or your aunt in another state, or your coworker who only gets his news from a specific social media platform. Maybe everyone around you actually gets the same news you do. But you also know that there is a very different version of reality out there that many people are deeply believing in. So, in that case, how do we figure out what's true versus what's convenient? How do we talk to each other if we don't have the same baseline of understanding about perhaps anything? We'd argue that this is where critical thinking skills come in. But what do we even mean when we say critical thinking skills?
And we're so glad you asked. This episode is for anyone who wants to think deeper about what we mean when we say critical thinking skills and how we can use them to bridge the divides in our communities, our country, maybe even our own households. You're listening to the podcast, What Do You Mean by That? We're your co-hosts, Sarah and Misasha. Well, welcome back to the podcast in episode 71. Would you please introduce yourself for our listeners?
Colin Seale, Think Law, and I'm excited to be able to rejoin you all for this conversation today.
I'm really excited because this is about a topic that I think is really important for every single person to think about how to do better. You know, we hear a lot nowadays about how everybody needs better critical thinking skills. When we think about why people say this, right now, a lot of people are like, well, it's because AI is coming up and that's going to edge out our education system's focus on rote memorization. We need people to really develop their critical thinking skills. Some other folks say, like you did before AI even became a thing, that we need to really be able to fully understand the world and like question not just why it is the way it is, but be able to imagine what it could be. And I feel like nowadays, especially in this situation of extreme divides in our country, that's really, really important. So I would like to ask you, as an expert in this, what are critical thinking skills and why do you think they're important here in 2025?
So that's a great way to kick off the conversation. I It's interesting because a lot of times when you think about like what is critical thinking, it takes me back to this idea of when I started Think Law a decade ago. We started off by doing a lot of surveying to kids. And what's so interesting is that yeah, you got that pocket of kids that you ask, what is critical thinking? And they say, oh, it's when you think critically. I'm like, all right, great. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Right. You got another pocket of kids that say it's when you're being really critical about something. And I thought that was interesting because a lot of times what critical thinking does require is a healthy degree of skepticism, right? This idea that we're not necessarily married to this outcome. We're not married to this like initial gut feeling that I had, but I'm constantly being very skeptical as I'm going through it. But then what really, really got me was one of our responses from a kid in Las Vegas from a high poverty school. What is critical thinking? What teachers don't allow us to do in school. And it had me step back for a second. I was like, huh. And it had me thinking, I started teaching right in the No Child Left Behind era, right? In the No Child Left Behind era, I was teaching in Washington, D.C. And what's so interesting to note, right, is that there was one moment in time where George W. Bush was actually able to string together a very articulate sentence. I'm like, how did he do this? This was an amazing sentence. He said, it is time to stop the soft bigotry of low expectations. I was like, who just said that? Was that George W.? Was that W? And the thing about this phrase is like, okay, the soft bigotry of low expectations and all these things about No Child Left Behind led to a lot of policy changes. It was not required for schools to say, let's get rid of arts. Let's get rid of music. Let's get rid of this. Let's only do reading test prep and math test prep, right? These were decisions that were made in a space of fear, in a space of compliance. I'm not sure what it was. When you think about this idea that it's not what I'm allowed to do in school, it's helpful to start thinking about, okay, like if we were all having access to critical thinking, what might that look like? What would that actually entail? How will we define it? We already talked about what it's not, right? But in thinking like a lawyer, which was my first book, and I recently just did a second edition on it that just came out, Framework for Teaching Critical Thinking to All Students. The idea of critical thinking is not just your critical thinking skills, not just the ability to analyze or the ability to interpret, right? It goes beyond your skills. It goes to your dispositions? Like, what are your habits and mindsets of critical thinking? How likely is it that you'll apply the critical thinking that you have to various problems that you experience about life, academics, and career? Because we all have that one friend, that one child that outlies, even, or maybe even ourselves. We might consider ourselves to be pretty brilliant, but we find some way to do some really dumb stuff on a regular basis, right? You're like, what just happened here? You're supposed to be so smart. But a lot of times, the difference between knowing better and doing better is distinguished by having these critical thinking skills, but missing those dispositions to go with those skills, right? And this is tricky because we got to do it across different contexts. Thinking critically as a salesperson is different than thinking critically as a sales manager, right? So there's this idea of thinking like, okay, this is a pretty intense set of skills and dispositions that has to be across different dispositions. And the one thing that we add, and I think listeners to this podcast would appreciate this piece of it, is that you can have all the critical thinking skills in the world, but no one's going to listen to you if you're a jerk. It's the idea that embedded in all of this is this underlying belief that doing right is more important than being right. Doing right is more important than being right, right? This idea that, like, I don't always know what doing right means, but I do know that we'll be in a very different world today if people understood that just because I can does not mean that I should. Think about how different social media would be. Just because I can does not mean that I should. So that's really kind of the more nuanced, fleshed out definition that we kind of have as our working model of what critical thinking is.
So I love that. I also want to note that I really hate that one of the side effects of 2025 is making me nostalgic for certain moments of George W. Bush and like some Republicans that I was like, wow, like look how great they were. And then I just kind of, smack myself across the face and like, wait a second. So, that sentence though was a good moment. I'll say that, especially
For sure.
now. I appreciate the addition of doing better as a concept. And I think because when we hear, critical thinking today, right? And I think some folks may confuse the concept, and I'm talking about adults, right? And adults who are smart adults, right, might confuse critical thinking with, sort of taking any counter narrative and diving down this like rabbit hole of conspiracy theory peddling, or folks may think that they're thinking critically, but sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? And so you may be in sort of this vortex or echo chamber of, ideas that just sort of reinforce your own. So how do we avoid some of these common pitfalls, right? Especially in 2025, especially in an era of, disinformation or misinformation where we're questioning constantly in a way that, I feel like we haven't. What is the truth? Where is the truth?
Sure, sure. And I think what you're saying is really important because you are absolutely right. There are some people that believe that like critical thinking means we gotta question like everything to the level of like, wait a minute. So all you ever do is believe the alternate theory of the universe. Like no matter what, don't trust those people, but I'm going to trust some random online forum. But I'm going to trust these people in this Facebook group, right? There's this level of like, okay, like I'm not quite sure how we got there, but I think a part of how we got there is the way that we tend to view what critical thinking might look like. A lot of times, like we've got a whole curriculum, right, that uses all these different real life legal cases to engage kids in critical thinking. And what I noticed as I was going around the country is I might be in like a third grade class and they're doing our lesson, one of the lessons that we have, and they're all lessons that are designed intentionally to be very funky and they get our kids thinking just a little bit differently about things. I'm sure we all have had our own experiences, no judgment, with animals in public places. Be it service animals or just like your buddy that's just sitting there with you in a restaurant, it is what it is. But of all places, Florida is always very interesting for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that's interesting about Florida is the kind of animals that people attempt to bring into Walmart. Stay with me here, okay? So in this lesson, kids are looking at these different things and they're trying to consider whether or not this thing is okay to bring into a Walmart. And somebody comes in with a pet rooster. Is that okay? right? And kids are often being asked, well, okay, well, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Who thinks it's okay? Who thinks it's not, right? And then there's also like a squirrel. Like a pet squirrel is an interesting pet to have, even more interesting to bring into Walmart. But again, is it okay? What do you think? Yes or no? And then there was a baby gator. And I'm like, I get that it's Florida. And in many cases, that gator might be on their home turf. But then again, I'm not quite sure about it. But here's where we go wrong. A lot of times we have these things that lack rigor, where it's just like, well, you tell me what you think, what you think, what you think, and it's all about what you think. Instead, it might be a subtle nuance, but it makes a big difference. Instead, what we ask our kids to do, what we teach to parents during our parent workshops, we even talk to business professionals and people in nonprofits and social work agencies about is instead of saying, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? It's like, all right, what's the best argument to allow a gator into Walmart? What's the best argument to not allow a gator into Walmart? And if I'm looking at those two comparatively, which one is the stronger argument? Which argument wins based off of the strength of what I'm doing? So now I'm forced to actually inquire into the merits of a thing, right? And now I'm looking at it from the point where I'm not just going off of vibes. I feel as though I don't care how you feel actually. And one of the things that happened when I was a lawyer, right? And the whole idea of thinking like a lawyer, like I'm a lawyer, I'm a math teacher that went to law school at night. And I realized that in law school and in practicing law, you got to be ready to defend any position at any moment, right? Like I can have one case this morning where I'm defending side A of an argument. And later this afternoon, I might be arguing the exact opposite side. But I'm not married to the merits. I'm not married to one particular viewpoint of things. I'm able to kind of see things in a much more nuanced way and like weigh the strength of the different arguments. So that's kind of a big nuance. Like, how do I make a claim and back that up with evidence and be able to understand how the other side might make a claim and back it up with evidence as well? And then compare and extract and synthesize which one of these is actually the way it should go. And it shouldn't be a slam dunk because most things are actually a closer call than we think.
I, first of all, greatly appreciate that example because that's hilarious. And this may or may not be true, but it reminds me vaguely of something I read in a relationship book about difficult how to solve conflicts in a marriage. Say you want to put a pool into your backyard and you really want it and your partner really doesn't want it, and you have to come up with arguments for why each, and then you have to weigh because you can't have half a pool. You either do or you do not. You don't bring a gator halfway in and halfway not. Like you do need to be able to make a decision and you have to lay out the argument and weigh which one makes more sense, which one matters more to the greater good. So I appreciate the idea of naming the merits as a structure a lot. And it got me thinking if we were to take a step back from that example and break down critical thinking into its main parts, what would you say those are?
So I was to kind of do like a meta-analysis of that example. I want to describe a process that I think is a really important part of what happens as a human when you're engaged in a critical thinking process. The part that doesn't sound like the entry point, because it doesn't sound very scientific, is your gut feeling. A lot of times people disregard their gut feeling, but you shouldn't do that. Your gut feeling is actually an extremely powerful source, right? Like in many ways, it's our connective tissue. Like your gut feeling isn't just some random sixth sense, it's all your five senses, plus your values, your identity, your biases, your preferences, your education in school, your education out of school. And that all plays in to create this gut feeling where you're like, whether or not you think this thing is okay in a Walmart, like that's where this comes from, right? When you read a news story, I never forget this, right? I was reading a news story and I saw the headline, and headlines are meant to be very salacious on purpose, right? And I read the headline that said, Muslim woman discriminated against on airplane. And I'm just like, oh, what's going on here? Click into the article, I'm reading it. And it's talking about the fact when the woman was given a can of soda, the little thing to open up the can was already taken off before it was given to her. And she was like, I'm not sure why you would do this. Why'd you do this? You didn't do this to anyone else's can. Okay. Now, my gut feeling at that point was like, this seems ridiculous. This doesn't seem true. This doesn't seem like this actually happened. I think this is someone that's taken something too far. This is like making a mockery out of discrimination. I don't know about all this, right? And as I read further, I read that this woman happens to be the head of religious studies for like an esteemed university. And I was like, oh, shoot. And now I saw her views as more plausible. And now I wondered, like, man, like I really didn't give her the benefit of the doubt from the very beginning because I came up with this with a sense of defensiveness. It came out of this from a sense of like, there are so many things that happen in that world that are not okay, that are biased, that are jacked up. I don't like these trivial things happening. I, based off of who this woman was, now have more reason to believe that she's not just making this a spectacle for the purpose of making it a spectacle. But this process of having a gut feeling means that I am also very curious, very open, and very okay with getting myself proven wrong. I'm okay with being wrong, right? What usually happens in the way that most people navigate these things is we don't navigate them as critical thinkers. We navigate them as ideologues. We navigate them as people that are certain they are right. So it's very different when I see a headline and everything I'm doing for that point, I want to double down on what I already think. You ever been into an argument on social media? Everybody's citing sources. Like, where are these sources coming from? I don't know, but I know that that source backs up where I'm coming from. And it's not this curiosity, there's not this level of like really being able to sort of build yourself a little bit differently, right? Like, even I remember Congresswoman AOC said something a few years ago. She was on a stage with Coach, the writer between the world and me, or whatever. And I remember she said something about like she was criticizing Gates and Bezos and all these people, and she's like, you don't make $1 billion, you take $1 billion. And I was like, what's that even mean? That's ridiculous, right? And I'm looking at this from the standpoint of I own a small business, and like, I don't have $1 billion, but I would love to have $1 billion. And I feel like you got to work hard, you got to do this kind of stuff and whatever. And I remember being in a Facebook thing with a guy that I follow and interact with, and he's like, Colin, listen, you can make $1 million idea from a garage. But have you actually ever thought about what it takes to accumulate $1 billion in wealth? Like, how do you actually do that without exploitation? How do you do that without whatever? And I was like, huh, good point. But this is not the way social media typically goes, right? So if we're doing the critical thinking process, we got to be able to be very explicit that I've got a gut feeling and I've got to transform from having that gut feeling to having an informed opinion. It might still be an opinion, but it's not just going off of vibes. It's not just going off of like what I think so and what my clan thinks, right? It really is about like, I've got a nuanced perspective of something because I've been able to actually like question myself, prove myself wrong, and somehow like have a much more articulate viewpoint of what's happening. And if you can't do that, here's my one test. My one test to know that you're in a place where you've actually gone through the critical thinking process. Simple question. Can you powerfully articulate the rationale of the other side? If you can't do that, you probably haven't actually done it. If they're all morons, if they're all idiots, they all don't know what's going on, then you're probably not there, right? And this is something that actually begs us to explore the question of empathy and understanding. Before we were in this anti-vax period around COVID, we had a big anti-vax movement that was growing in our country prior to that. And I want to ask you all a question. I'm curious if you can guess this. There was one Facebook group that was actually very effective at helping people who were anti-vax reconsider their stance. What would you guess was the characteristics of the people in this Facebook group?
My gut. I'm very
Uh-huh.
curious if it was people similar in alignment, like they were white women, to those who were also like the people, assuming it was the people who were anti-vaxxing. Was it similar in characteristic to those who were, assuming that was white women who were very anti-vax, other women of similar demographics calling them in to think more critically?
So they were similar demographically, but there was something else that was a similarity between them.
Was it that the group had been formerly anti-vax, like believers, strong believers who saw something different?
Yes. And some people say, they guess that it's someone that was anti-vax and then their kids died. I'm like, no, it wasn't that. It wasn't that. Okay. What it was people that can really understand what it was like to be in those shoes. So what ended up happening is we asked this question of like, let's say you had a sincere belief that vaccines were dangerous. How might that impact your life? How much you actually feel? And we started talking about these feelings of isolation, these feelings of being a social outcast, these feelings of being a pariah, someone that's on the outskirts, someone that's a weirdo. And that level of isolation can sometimes make you feel like that group connection becomes so important to you. So there was something really powerful about somebody that has been part of that group and can talk to you from a sense of, I know you. I got you. Like, I see where you're coming from. I don't think you're a moron. I don't think all this stuff, right? And like, there's this level of being able to connect in a personal kind of way that is very similar to the way that people that are being caught up in like very extremist, like terrorist cells, like we're able to turn that around through similar kind of demographic groups. People that get really caught up in white supremacy kinds of groups, whatever, again, like it's people that understand that world that are the best at being able to convert people from going down that path. So it really is something about getting to that level of empathy where it doesn't have to get to that extreme at a basic level. You know, if we think about the people we interact with at work, right? Like if we start actually thinking about like, that guy gets on my nerves, but like, really, what's the deal with this guy actually? And we approach things with a deeper sense of curiosity, like, I wonder what's really behind all this. Because all we ever see is that surface, but what's beneath the iceberg? It's really where that kind of comes out. Like, so we gotta maintain that curiosity. And we can't just count on that gut feeling to guide us through everything. We gotta be able to like continue to inquire about different sources of evidence so we can feel like whatever our opinions are a lot more informed.
To jump in there with a thought observation, something I'm curious about, because I know the science is showing in psychology that it is more difficult for people to have empathy for those who are outside of our group, who people we deem different than us. And so in that sense, based on what you've said so far, I feel like some of the character traits, the dispositions you were talking about, you need to have confidence in yourself. It is so important for us to understand what identity groups we hold, who are our people who are similar to us, who we can extend that empathy to more naturally. And are we willing to be humble enough to be curious first as opposed to be right all the time? And do we have capacity in our lives to show care? Because all of that takes time and effort in a time where I feel like so many people would rather just be busy.
You talk about humility. I want to kind of get something I think is a little bit easier to practice because humility can sometimes be hard to like kind of stimulate in folks, but like think of something else that we can practice. And this is something that I think steers in a different direction than a lot of like DEI conversations because I would say for the last decade, I've heard so many different people talking about this phrase that always made me feel a little icky. And the phrase was implicit bias. We talk about like, police brutality and these different things, whatever, is like implicit bias. And I remember I reached an actual like fever pitch of like, this is my breaking point. There was a point where maybe in 2017, 2018, during the first Trump administration, a group of teachers in Idaho or Iowa for Halloween dressed up like the wall. They dressed up like a border wall. And I remember having a colleague out here in Arizona that had made the comment like, and this is why educators need implicit bias training. And I was like, what in the world are we even saying? Implicit bias is this weird thing that's like subconsciously there's this thing happening. And I think in many ways it lets us off the hook. What if instead of this kind of humanizing, well, everybody has implicit, like what if instead of doing that, we actually presumed that we all were acting in ways that showed very clear explicit bias. The example that I gave you when I was reading that article about that Muslim person who happened to be a professor, right? Like my explicit bias that didn't take her seriously until I saw that she was an educated person with prominence. And I was like, oh, she wouldn't risk that for something that was trivial. So like my explicit bias was shown there. And what I ask all the time is when you make a policy, when you're making a new rule, when you're thinking about these different things you're doing, what if when you did it, you presumed that somebody is going to be harmed by it? And you actually start going through the process of wondering who might be harmed by it. What if when we're making opinions, we actually explicitly think like, you know what? I know that explicitly there are things that come into my mind around this. You talked about relationships earlier. You know, in today's modern relationship world, right? A lot of folks are recognizing there's not really a point in doing couples therapy if I haven't done therapy for myself, right? Because a lot of times I need to be able to understand, like, what are these things coming from? What are these, like, hangups and things that are affecting me? Because I'm coming in this with my own set of things. But if I'm able to actually know it, it changes the way that we approach things. I can tell you that I grew up with a lot of financial insecurity. I grew up and my father wasn't around. Someone that was supposed to take care of me didn't take care of me. One of my earliest memories that I remember as a kid is standing outside with a bunch of stuff all over the place. I didn't realize until I was in my 30s that that was me getting evicted because my dad was supposed to send my mother money for rent that never came. This means that when it comes to a lot of money matters, I'm wired. I'm very, very, very suspicious. Like it's really, really hard. And as a small business owner, like I know that if I'm having a conversation with somebody about something having to do with money, like I've got to actually understand my explicit bias coming into it, not some implicit who knows there kind of thing. I've got to own it, or else I will be able to see harm resulting from those interactions. So a big part of us being able to do this, which is why I think that gut feeling becomes so important, is we have to be very aware, very attuned, and very honest about what our gut feelings are and where they come from. And only when we do that can we actually approach the world with the requisite humility that you're referring to.
I really love that. Well, the lawyer in me in particular, especially because thinking about the implicit bias CLE training that we all have to do and how that's always framed, really loves this discussion of explicit bias, right? Because I think you're absolutely right. We have a gut feeling that is our explicit bias as long as we are thoughtful enough and introspective enough to really understand how that shows up and who we heard. And I think that so many people should hear this, especially in 2025, around how we make policies and what we're doing and to own it in a way that we have not been able to. I think about, I spend a lot of time in classrooms now, which is like sort of my favorite, right? And spending time in elementary school classrooms in particular is my favorite because those kids understand that and own stuff and are very open and ask the best questions. And I think about this study that I read, from several years ago that was talking about how the vast majority of fourth grade teachers really believe in teaching critical thinking skills and kind of getting kids to ask those questions. And so I have one kid who's in fifth grade and he's great at that. In fact, he over indexes on the asking questions side, which I mean is going to be fine for him later in life, like kind of annoying as a parent. But I have another son who's in middle school, right? Heading into eighth grade soon. And that same study talks about how by the time kids get in eighth grade, those teachers have refocused away from teaching critical thinking skills to focusing more on memorization and test taking because they need to get these kids into standardized tests and college prep and all of that. And I think about that shift a lot. And then I think about as we're adults, like I'm an adult in my 40s, how far I am now from, even that kid moment of being encouraged to ask and being, thinking about it. And so I can only imagine, and especially in this backdrop of what is happening now, how out of practice we really are at, being introspective, thinking about, that gut feeling, like thinking about the merits, right? And not just going on vibes or how we feel or whatever. I feel like a lot of adults, we just don't have these skills. So how can we practice improving these skills, especially now, right, where I feel like the overarching message out of fear is to stay silent, to not question things, to kind of go along so you won't be the one who's under scrutiny.
So, as adults, how can we practice this? You've heard the phrase before. Well, I've always heard it growing up, practice makes perfect, but then you realize that's not quite right. And only like perfect practice makes perfect. Because if you practice doing something the wrong way over and over again, it doesn't actually help anything or move anything forward. So I think this is tricky. I think this is really tricky because if you take certain folks, I would argue that the vast majority of adults probably work in compliance-based spaces, right? Like, retail is compliance-based, like law is compliance-based, finance is compliance. So a lot of these things are like, we follow the rules and we do this kind of thing. And I think where we try to get to, where I try to push teams and leaders towards is the idea that I got this t-shirt that says doing right is better than being right. And, the reason we sell this t-shirt is because I believe it's a pretty ubiquitous construct that if I'm saying that doing right is more important than being right, it brings me back to the Seinfeld episode. Okay. I'm a huge Seinfeld fan. And it was a Seinfeld episode where he bounced a check at the bodega. Okay, I'll check at the bodega. And I don't know if any of y'all from places where they have bodegas, but like it's a whole thing where they put your check up there and it's whatever, and it's a whole thing of like, all right, cool. Right. And he's like, look, I'm so sorry I bounced a $20 check. You know what? Here's the $20 and here's an extra $20, and hopefully he can be whatever. And he's like, so you're not gonna take the check down? He's like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do that. It's store policy. It's like, but it's your store. It's like, even I am not bigger than the policy. And it's a ridiculous phrase, but how many times do we see this? How many times do we look, well, what does the employee handbook say and whatever? And we don't even actually think about any sort of human connection to what's going on because like, oh, even I am big, not bigger than the policy. No, I want human beings to matter more than the policy. I'm not telling you a blanket thing, let's break all the rules, but let's actually think and understand like why this rule is there, right? And this is something I'm thinking about from a very personal standpoint. I recently got a thing. My daughter, who's an identified gifted child, is at a school that doesn't have a gifted and talented program. It specializes in the arts. And just found out that for eighth grade, she's not going to be in honors English. She's going to be in regular eighth grade English. Because for honors English, you have to have an 85. Her scores for first semester were 81 and then an 84. Okay. So what I'm seeing here is like, okay, like this is such a disjointed kind of thing because it's like, what y'all really are looking at is like traditional measures of achievement, right? You're not doing placement based off of where kids might thrive the most, right? You're just based off like, okay, do they have this sort of number as if the number itself is, as if like achievement is actually the same goal for everyone. But the rule says 85, right? But like the rule itself, if we actually would have sat and thought when we were designing that rule, who could this rule explicitly harm? It might explicitly harm kids who are voracious readers who just don't really care to sit through passages that they don't like and they just circle whatever, right? So like we got to really think through like, okay, like, so what are we really trying to do? And it's like, well, the policy says this. I'm like, all right, cool. All right. And I know myself and I humbly just recuse myself in the entire conversation. That'll be up to my kid's mom to work out with that lady because I'm not doing it. I can't do it. I can't engage in that kind of thing. Right. But we see this all the time. Right. We see this kind of thing all the time where you're like, okay, like, but as adults, can we actually be okay with the fact that like it might be plausible to make exceptions to the rule from time to time? And one of the ways we kind of get kids to get to this point using our Think Love program, we have this old school case, right? And it's a really interesting one. It's about a dude who got more time tacked to his jail sentence, breaking out of prison. But he broke out of prison because the prison was on fire. And it's this idea like, yes, we don't want to encourage people breaking out of prison, but also should he be like, man, it's getting hot in here. So you know what? I'm not trying to add more time to my sentence. And we laugh at the absurdity of it, but like this case went all the way to court. Like this had to be refuted, right? There was a time where with the Pony Express, where like delivering mail was a very dangerous thing to do in our country. So they have a lot of laws against doing anything to deter the process of moving mail. There's another real life case about a mail carrier who was suspected of murder. So the detective arrested him on his route. And the detective got arrested under this statute. What was he supposed to do? Make an appointment? Excuse me, I need to lock you up for murder. Can you meet me at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Like, that's ridiculous. So there's this idea that, like, are we willing? Are we willing to go to bat? Are we willing to actually challenge this idea of the way it is so we can get to the way it ought to be? Which will require us to understand our power in creating that ought. There is no such thing as the system. We are the system. It's always been us. When we decide to just let the system do their work without questions, then we let the system do its work. But every time that we intercede, every time that we interfere, every time we say like, yeah, nah, every time that we decide doing right is more important than being right, then we're creating what it ought to be.
Mic drop. Okay, we're done now, but thank you. I really felt encouraged and seen by what you just said, because I think often people disengage by saying, well, this changing things is much bigger than me. What can one person do? But you're empowering us to remember that humans made these rules to begin with, and they all start somewhere. And so why not start with us? What else haven't we asked that you think is important to share when it comes to being a better human and using more critical thinking?
So I think in that same sense about the system piece of it, There's another thing that became kind of a misnomer and we kind of used the wrong way. And there's a superintendent, a retired superintendent of Yonkers, New York, Edwin Quezada, who gave me this insight and it really stuck out to me. I remember in the early 90s, Hillary Clinton had that book, It Takes a Village. We've all heard that motto, like it takes a village to raise a child. And he talked about really not liking the whole premise of this book. Because in his mind, it doesn't actually take a village. It takes one person. It takes one person who makes it their job. And along those lines, I start to think to myself, sometimes we presume the village will. There's a district we work with in Michigan, right out of Kalamazoo, called Mattawan Schools. And I remember we doing some work with them, and I came across this story about a little boy in this district who had chronic illness. And particular illness he had required him to get blood transfusions at a ridiculous rate. And the community, individuals in his community, stepped up, organized, like the kinds of blood drives that you would see in big cities, right? And it was incredible what they were able to do. And there was this quote from the mom that a lot of people always presume someone else is going to do it, but it's got to be you. Like it's going to be you. Like there's no cavalry coming to save us. It's going to be you going to that board meeting or to that city council meeting or being a part of your neighborhood association. It's going to be you that's making an unpopular comment in your next door group about like, hey, you know what? Like not everybody that's walking the street is someone that we need to call the police on, right? Like it's going to be you. And that means that you're going to have to temporarily sacrifice some idea of what you might think is comfort for what you know is actually best. It might mean you might be able to sacrifice a little bit of what you've got going on for what might be something that is like a part of the greater good. And that's the risk, but it's also the reward, right? And I don't say this because I'm trying to be preachy. I say this because I regret the times when I didn't do this. I regret when I didn't do this. I had a kid who in many ways was a kid that you never forget, right? He had a really bad stuttering problem. I had a big speech impediment when I was a kid, so I automatically connected with him. He was way behind in math. He had a lot of things going on where his mom had substance abuse issues. He was like a father figure to his little brother. And he just was an amazing kid that had a lot of different challenges. Kids would bully him. He would get into a lot of fights. And one day I was getting some coaching because I was needing some help on my math stuff, working with the math coach. And somehow we walk outside in the hallway and this kid is walking around. His pants are kind of sagging off his butt and whatever, you know. And this teacher like barks at him, "Pull up your pants," and he's like, "Oh, whatever." And she's like, "This guy is on my shit list." I'm like, "Wait a minute, what did you just say? Did you just say a little kid is on your shit list? Like, what is wrong with you? Why would you say that to him? Like, he's a kid. You don't even know his story. Like you think he's this bad kid, gets in trouble. He gets in trouble because he's always defending himself. And like he has a pretty stressful life. If you knew how hard he worked, he's actually already at grade level, even though he had to come back to him. Like, you don't even know him. In fact, forget about him. It's about me. If you got a problem with him, you got a problem with me. So I don't want to hear you talk like that again. And the reality is, I've spent 20 years practicing that speech because when it actually went down, I didn't say anything. I said nothing at all. And in fact, what really haunts me to this day is the idea that like I chose adult comfort, right? Because at the end of the day, I can't tell her nothing. Like I'm the one that's having problems in my math classroom. Like she's got semi-supervisory authority. Like I can't question her. So I just kind of let it go. And the tragic part of this story is 3 months from that day, he was expelled from the school because he was actually on her shit list. So when I'm thinking about the costs, when I'm thinking about the nature of like the way it is versus the way it ought to be, I learned the hard way that I don't only have the power, but I've got an obligation to fight for that ought wherever I can. And that's my plea to folks that are listening. Like, don't think it's somebody else's job. Don't think it's somebody else's job. There's no such thing as a system, and there's no cavalry coming to save you. It's going to be the day-to-day actions from people just like you that create a better tomorrow.
I'm so glad you shared that. I think it's so powerful. And I also think if we're being honest, we all have those stories, right? Of the moment where we could have done something, we could have said something, and we didn't as a choice, right? For many different reasons, let's say. But it is us. I also think coming off a very long little league season full of pain, that kids are not tiny adults. Kids are kids too. And I just want to put that plug out there for all of these coaches heading into All-Star season. That said, we could obviously talk all day with you because this is always such a highlight. But for folks who want to find you and talk with you themselves, where can they find you? Where can they find that new second edition of your book? Where can they learn more about you?
Sure, sure. So you can follow me on social media, Colin Seale on Instagram, Colin E. Seale on Twitter X. And my books, Thinking Like a Lawyer and Tangible Equity, are available. Thinking Like a Lawyer second edition is available wherever you buy books. And if you want to know more about the work that we do with organizations, with schools and education, you can check us out at thinklaw.us. And yeah, follow us, kind of see what we're talking about. And hopefully you can leave from all this inspired to actually take the action that we know needs to happen.
Thank you so much for your energy, your perspective. I really feel great about this conversation. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it too.
You've been listening to What Do You Mean by That? A show dedicated to being better humans and getting loud for all of us. Hat tip to Sarah's daughter for the logo, and huge thanks to Misasha's son for our incredible theme music. Find out more and subscribe to our newsletter at whatdoyoumeanbythat.com. Because as always, it's all of us or it's none of us.